Turkey's initial reaction to the creation of Israel was cautious. It voted against the United Nations partition plan for Palestine in 19, wary of upsetting Arab states and concerned about Soviet influence in the region. During the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Turkey remained neutral and even barred Turkish volunteers from joining the Arab armies, signaling that while it sympathized with Arab concerns, it was not eager to confront the emerging Jewish state. Then, in a groundbreaking move, Turkey formally recognized the State of Israel on March 28, becoming the first Muslim-majority country to do so. This recognition was driven in part by Turkey's Western-oriented foreign policy in the early Cold War. Aligning with the United States and Europe meant opening ties with Israel despite potential backlash in the Islamic world. Turkish officials defended the decision by noting Israel was already a reality accepted by many nations and even by the Arabs in armistice talks at the time. Following recognition, Ankara and Jerusalem established diplomatic missions at a modest level. Turkey sent a dafur to Tel Aviv, and by 1952 the two countries had exchanged diplomats at the legation level. Periodically, Turkish leaders dialed back the relationship under pressure from the Arab world. In one early instance, Turkey joined Western powers in 1951 in criticizing Egypt's blockade of the Suez Canal to Israeli shipping, a stance that provoked anger from Arab capitals. Responding to regional outrage, Ankara quietly withdrew its newly appointed ambassador to Israel and maintained relations at a lower diplomatic level thereafter. Such moves exemplified Turkey's balancing act. It maintained ties with Israel to satisfy its Western alliance interests, but often only covertly or unofficially to mollify Arab and Muslim opinion. This secret friendship reached an apex in 1958, when Turkey's Prime Minister Adnan Menderes met secretly with Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. Together they forged a confidential pact, often called the Peripheral Alliance, pledging cooperation on intelligence and security matters. That covert 1958 alliance, sparked by both countries' fears of Soviet influence and of Egypt's pan-Arab ambitions under Gamal Abdel, showed how strategically aligned Turkey and Israel could be even as Turkey kept such ties out of public view. Throughout the 1950s, relations between Turkey and Israel were friendly but kept deliberately low. Both countries saw value in cooperation. Israel, isolated in the region, reached out to non-Arab states on the Middle Eastern periphery, while Turkey, a secular republic with Western ties, found common ground with Israel's democratic and non-Arab character. Notably, covert interactions flourished beneath the surface of official caution. Intelligence and military links were quietly established. For example, Israel's Mossad operated a station in Turkey as early as the 1950s to share intelligence and expertise with the Turkish security services. Trade also inched forward through back channels, with goods exchanged indirectly to avoid Arab boycotts. Yet Turkey had to walk a fine line. Popular sentiment and solidarity with fellow Muslim nations meant Ankara could not appear too close to Israel. By the end of the 1950s, Turkey and Israel enjoyed a cordial relationship beneath the radar. Turkish secular elites admired Israel's technological progress and its defiance of communist influence, seeing Israel as a natural partner on the Middle East's edge. Meanwhile, Israel viewed Turkey, a NATO member, as a vital friend in a hostile region. Still, all cooperation took place under the table. Turkish leaders calculated that openly embracing Israel could isolate them in the Muslim world or jeopardize vital links to Arab neighbors. This pattern of quiet collaboration defined the early decades of Turkey-Israel relations. Close strategic ties cloaked by cautious diplomacy. As the 1960s approached, however, shifting regional currents would test this delicate balancing act. In the 1960s and 1970s, Turkey recalibrated its policy as regional conflicts in its own interests in the Muslim world came to the forefront. After a decade of relatively pro-Western, pro-Israeli leanings, Ankara gradually tilted toward a more neutral and even pro-Arab stance. Several factors drove this shift: the need for Arab oil and trade partners, solidarity with fellow Muslim countries, and Turkey's brewing disputes with Greece, which made support from Middle Eastern neighbors diplomatically valuable. Turkey supported the Palestinian cause more visibly. For example, voting in favor of inviting the Palestine Liberation Organization into the UN as an observer in 1974 and later endorsing the 1975 United Nations resolution equating Zionism with racism. In 1979, Turkey allowed the PLO to open an information office in Ankara. Notably, Turkey did this while still only granting Israel's mission in Ankara the same low diplomatic status. a symbolic show of parity between its relations with Israel and the Palestinians. And in a further gesture to the Arab world, Turkey joined Islamic countries in diplomatically isolating Egypt for making peace with Israel in 1979. Turkey downgraded its relations with Cairo after Camp David, reflecting general Muslim world sentiment. The Arab-Israeli conflict, especially the Palestinian question, became increasingly significant in Turkish rhetoric. Turkey began voicing support for Palestinian rights and echoed Arab calls for Israeli withdrawal from occupied lands. After the 1967 Six-Day War, though notably it did so within a framework that still accepted Israel's right to exist behind secure borders, the June 1967 war was a watershed. Israel's victory and occupation of Arab territories put Turkey in a tight spot. On one hand, Turkey did not join the war and was not directly threatened by Israel. On the other, Turkish leaders could not ignore the outcry in the Muslim world over Israeli expansion. In the aftermath, Turkey supported UN resolutions urging Israel to withdraw from occupied territories, including East Jerusalem. Turkish Prime Minister Süleyman Demirel even hosted Jordan's Hussein in 1967, and together they affirmed the need for an Israeli pause. Nevertheless, Ankara stopped short of breaking relations with Israel, a line that many Arab states took. Instead, Turkey maintained its diplomatic ties at the downgraded level, keeping channels open quietly even as it publicly criticized Israeli policies in forums like the United Nations. This was emblematic of Turkey's balanced course in those years, condemning Israeli actions in solidarity with Arabs, but not fully siding against Israel. Throughout the 1970s, this balancing act continued amid turbulent regional events. A major downturn in Turkey's oil relations came in 1980. That summer, the Israeli Knesset enacted a law proclaiming a united Jerusalem as Israel's capital, a move not recognized internationally. In protest, Turkey took the decisive step of downgrading its diplomatic relations with Israel to the lowest level. The Israeli ambassador was expelled and only a skeletal diplomatic presence was maintained thereafter. Turkey was not alone. Many countries, including all Muslim-majority states, reacted strongly against Israel's unilateral annexation of East Jerusalem. Also, around this time, Turkey decisively aligned itself with the Palestinian national cause by officially recognizing the state of Palestine in 1988, following Yasser Arafat's declaration of independence. Thus, by the late 1980s, Turkey's political ties with Israel had reached a low ebb. Publicly, constrained by Turkey's need for Arab goodwill, during a period when it faced economic troubles and a simmering conflict with Greece over Cyprus. Despite the chilly official posture in the 90s, it's important to note that Turkey never completely severed contact with Israel. Trade and covert cooperation continued quietly, and tellingly, even as Ankara hosted a PLO mission, it kept that office and the Israeli mission at equal diplomatic footing, signaling that Turkey still saw value in its link to Israel. This period set a pattern. Turkey would show solidarity with the Arab and Islamic consensus when the Palestinian issue flared, yet it retained a pragmatic openness to Israel, ready to improve ties when regional tensions cooled. That opportunity arrived as the Cold War ended in the Middle East. Peace process began in the early 1990s. The 1990s marked a golden era in Turkish-Israeli relations, with the Soviet threat gone and the Arab-Israeli conflict seemingly on a path toward resolution. Turkey felt freer to openly embrace Israel as a partner. In 1991, Turkey and Israel restored full diplomatic relations at the ambassadorial level, ending the decade-long This normalization came alongside the broad Middle East peace efforts. Indeed, the willingness of the Palestine Liberation Organization to negotiate with Israel, it more politically acceptable in Turkey to engage openly with Israel. Turkish President Turgut Özal and Prime Minister Süleyman Demirel seized this moment to strengthen ties with Israel as part of Turkey's pro-modernization trajectory in the post-Cold War environment. Several converging strategic interests drove the Turkish. First, Turkey was seeking advanced military technology and weapons upgrades that its traditional Western allies were sometimes hesitant to provide due to concerns over Turkey's human rights record. Israel's defense industry, however, was eager and able to supply modern arms and This meshed with Turkey's needs, leading to extensive military agreements. Second, both countries shared adversaries in the region, Syria and Iran. In the 1990s, Syria was harboring the PKK, a Kurdish terrorist group at war with Turkey, and Iran's Islamist regime was seen by both Ankara's secular establishment, Jerusalem as a destabilizing force exporting extremism. By cooperating, Turkey and Israel hoped to contain these threats. For example, Intelligence sharing between Mossad and Turkey's mighty intensified around common concerns like Syria's support for Kurdish rebels and Iran-backed militant networks. Third, Turkey's staunchly secular military and political elite viewed rising Islamist movements with suspicion. Aligning with Israel, a fellow democracy with secular governance, was one way to bolster Turkey's secular, pro-Western orientation and counterbalance Islamic political currents at home. The Defense Pact allowed for joint military training, Israeli use of Turkish airspace for pilots, Turkish officers training in Israel, and collaboration on defense technology. Notably, Israel agreed to upgrade Turkey's aging F-4 Phantom jets and M60 tanks, contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and to share expertise on drones and intelligence. The same year, the free trade deal boosted commercial ties, leading to a surge in bilateral trade volume, from around $300 million in 1994 to over $1 billion by 2000. Cooperation also extended to water and energy. At one point, Turkey discussed selling fresh water from its rivers to Israel, and plans were floated for pipelines and other projects. High-level visits became routine. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin visited Turkey in 1996, and in 1998, Turkish Prime Minister Mesut Yilmaz visited Israel. The first trip at that level, the Turkish public, long kept distant from Israel, now saw images of war meetings and even joint military exercises. Israeli leaders, for their part, welcomed a strong, predominantly Muslim ally that could break their regional isolation and lend legitimacy to Israel's quest for acceptance in the Middle East. This convergence produced formalized alliances. In 1996, Turkey and Israel signed a landmark series of agreements, including a free trade agreement and a far-reaching defense cooperation agreement. A dramatic illustration of the partnership came in when Turkey nearly went to war with Syria over Damascus's support for the PKK. Israel openly sided with Turkey in this showdown, a signal of solidarity that did not go unnoticed in the region. Shortly thereafter, Syria expelled PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan, who was later captured, reportedly with the help of multiple intelligence agencies, possibly including Mossad. Within Turkey, not everyone cheered the closeness with Israel. The pro-Islamic Refah Party of Necamit, which briefly led a coalition government in 1996-97, was deeply uncomfortable with the military pacts with Israel. Erbakan, reflecting Islamist public sentiment, even attempted to pivot Turkey toward Iran and Libya, and was chilled by the general's pro-Israel enthusiasm. In 1997, Turkey's military guardians of secularism effectively pushed Erbakan out of power, in part due to alarm over his foreign policy orientation and hostility to the Israeli alliance. The episode underscored how Turkey-Israel cooperation had shifted the regional balance. Ankara and Jerusalem were, for the moment, strategic allies. By the end of the 1990s, Turkish-Israeli relations were arguably at their highest point ever. Both countries benefited. Turkey's military grew stronger and more confident in dealing with threats, and Israel gained a crucial friend in a predominantly hostile region, as well as lucrative defense and trade deal. Culturally, Israeli tourists flocked to Turkish resorts by the tens of thousands, enjoying visa-free travel and warm hospitality. Politically, Turkey's secular leaders and Israel's governments spoke of shared democratic values and a common fight against terrorism. The relationship was often described as an alliance of the periphery, or an alignment of two outsiders to the Arab Middle East, one a Jewish state, the other a secular Muslim-majority state, finding common cause. However, even in this honeymoon period, seeds of future friction were visible. Within Turkey, not everyone cheered the closeness with Israel. The pro-Islamic Refah Party of Nik, which briefly led a coalition government in 1996-97, was deeply uncomfortable with the military pacts with Israel. Erbakan, reflecting Islamist public sentiment, even attempted to pivot Turkey toward Iran and Libya, and was chilled by the general's pro-Israel enthusiasm. In 1997, Turkey's military guardians of secularism effectively pushed Erbakan out of power, in part due to alarm over his foreign policy orientation and hostility to the Israeli alliance. This internal tug-of-war hinted that if Islamically oriented politicians rose in Turkey, the relationship with Israel could face turbulence. Nonetheless, as long as the Turkish military and secular establishment held sway, the 1990s strategic partnership persisted. It would take new leadership and new conflicts in the 2000s to upend the status quo. The dawn of the 21st century brought changes that slowly began chipping away at the Turkey-Israel partnership. One major factor was the deterioration of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. The hopeful atmosphere of the 1990s gave way to renewed violence with the outbreak of the Second Intifada. In late 2000, nightly images of Israeli-Palestinian clashes, Israeli military crackdowns in the West Bank and Gaza, and suicide bombings in Israeli cities once again polarized regional opinion. In Turkey, public sympathy for the Palestinian cause surged, pressuring the government to distance itself somewhat from Israel. Even Turkey's staunchly secular leaders felt compelled to criticize Israeli actions during heavy fighting in the occupied territories. In 2002, for example, Turkish Prime Minister Bülent Ecevit condemned an Israeli military operation in the West Bank as genocide, a remark that shocked Israel and led it to lodge a formal protest. Although Ecevit's government did not break ties, such rhetoric indicated a cooling sentiment. The close military cooperation of the 1990s quietly continued on paper, but political goodwill was ebbing as the peace process fell apart. At the same time, Turkey underwent a domestic political revolution. In late 2002, the Justice and Development Party, a new conservative party with Islamist roots led by Recep Tayyip Erdogan, won elections and came to power. The AKP represented a more religiously minded segment of Turkish society and advocated a foreign policy of zero problems with neighbors, seeking improved relations with Arab and Muslim countries. Initially, the AKP government did not torpedo ties with Israel. In fact, Erdogan's administration maintained the formal military agreements and trade continued to grow. In 2005, Erdogan even paid an official visit to Israel, meeting Prime Minister Ariel Sharon and signaling that Turkey still valued its relations with the Jewish state. During that visit, Erdogan offered Turkish help as a mediator in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and stressed continued friendship. And true to its mediator aspirations, Turkey under AKP played an active diplomatic role in the mid-2000s. It facilitated indirect peace talks between Israel and Syria in 2007-8 and engaged with Hamas to encourage moderation. Turkey even contributed troops to the UN peacekeeping force in Lebanon after the 2006 Israel-Hezbollah war, working alongside Israeli forces in stabilizing southern Lebanon. All of this suggested that, at least initially, the AKP was willing to work with Israel and could carry forward the relationship, albeit with a different tone. However, as the 2000s progressed, several issues drove a wedge between Ankara and Jerusalem. Erdogan's government grew increasingly outspoken in support of the Palestinians and critical of Israel, treating of them a stance popular with his political base in Turkey. Each flare-up of violence in Gaza or the West Bank drew harsh rebukes from him. For instance, in 2004, after Israel's assassination of Hamas leader Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, Erdogan publicly denounced the killing as a terrorist act by Israel, language that infuriated Israeli officials. The cumulative effect of such incidents was a perceptible cooling of the once warm bilateral atmosphere. High-level strategic dialogue forums went quiet. Joint military exercises were postponed or cancelled. While trade and tourism remained robust, the military contracts were still in force. Politically, the two governments were drifting apart, largely over the Palestinian question. In December of that year, Israel launched Operation Cast Lead against Hamas in the Gaza Strip, a 3-week military campaign to stop rocket fire, which resulted in heavy Palestinian civilian casualties and destruction in Gaza. The war deeply angered Turkey's leaders. They felt personally betrayed, because just days before the operation, Prime Minister Ehud Olmert of Israel had been in Ankara talking peace with Syria, yet he gave Erdogan no warning of the impending Gaza attack. When the Gaza war unfolded on TV screens, Erdogan lambasted Israel's actions as savagery and a crime against humanity, marking the most vehement Turkish condemnation of Israel to date. This moment was a turning point, as one analyst put it, after which Turkish-Israeli political relations entered an. By the latter half of the 2000s, Turkey's regional orientation had shifted. Under Foreign Minister Ahmet, the concept of neo-Ottoman engagement took shape, meaning Turkey sought influence across the former Ottoman territories by championing Muslim causes and positioning itself as a regional leader. In this context, standing up to Israel could bolster Turkey's image on the Arab street and among its own conservative populace. Meanwhile, Israel's government grew frustrated with Erdogan's constant criticism, dismissing it at times as still. Until 2008, the countries avoided any irreversible breach. In fact, as noted, Turkey was mediating Israeli-Syrian peace feelers up to early 2008 and talks reportedly made progress. It seemed possible that Turkey could simultaneously befriend Israel and the Arab world. All that changed at the end of 2008. Israel's winter 2008 Gaza offensive set the stage for a dramatic deterioration in Turkey-Israel relations. Turkish public opinion, galvanized by graphic images from Gaza, rallied behind Erdogan's outspoken stance. In January 2009, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, the world witnessed an extraordinary incident that symbolized the rift. On a panel with Israeli President Shimon Peres, broadcast live, Prime Minister Erdogan fiercely criticized Israel's Gaza operation. When the moderator tried to cut him off, Erdogan famously exclaimed 1 minute. To silence Peres, accused the Israeli leader of knowing how to kill Palestinians, and then stormed off the stage in anger. The Davos confrontation instantly made headlines and turned Erdogan into a hero in many Arab eyes. But it also signaled a complete breakdown in the personal rapport between Turkish and Israeli leaders. Upon his return to a jubilant crowd in Istanbul, Erdogan reiterated that Turkey's indignation was directed at Israeli policies, not Jews, but the message was clear that a fundamental shift had occurred. The episode marked the end of the cordial era and the start of open animosity on the political level. Ankara immediately recalled its ambassador from Tel Aviv and delivered an ultimatum demanding an official apology from Israel, compensation for the victims' families, and the lifting of the Gaza blockade. In protest, Turkey also suspended many of its military cooperation agreements with Israel and barred Israeli forces from Turkish exercises. By September 2011, when a UN inquiry into the flotilla was leaked, the report criticized Israel as excessive force but paradoxically upheld the legality of the Gaza blockade. Angering Turkey, Ankara took further action. Turkey downgraded diplomatic relations to the second, expelling Israel's ambassador and essentially freezing official contacts. Erdogan's government declared that as long as Israel refused to apologize and end the Gaza siege, normal relations were impossible. Israel, for its part, was initially reluctant to apologize. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu expressed regret, and Israel eventually offered a sort of unofficial sorry for the loss of life, but it stopped short of the formal apology Turkey sought. Israeli officials believed that Turkey's strong reaction was driven not only by genuine outrage, but by Erdogan's ambition to posture as a champion of the Muslim world at Israel's expense. Feeling that an apology would not actually repair ties, Israel dug in its heels through 2011 instead. Israel responded to the rupture by strengthening alliances with Greece and the Greek Cypriot government, historic rivals of Turkey. By 2011-2012, Israel was conducting Air Force exercises with Greece and partnering in developing offshore gas fields with Cyprus, a development that Turkish leaders watched with concern. A new geopolitical fault line was emerging. Turkey on one side, and an informal bloc of Israel, Greece, and Cyprus on the other, competing over energy and influence in the Eastern Mediterranean. The flotilla fallout was the nadir of Turkey-Israel relations. For several years after 2010, the two countries maintained only very limited diplomatic engagement, tourism and mutual visits. Previously, Israeli vacationers had filled Turkish beaches. Now charter flights were cancelled. High-level dialogue ceased entirely. Leaders exchanged barbs instead of greetings. In Turkey, a series of popular dramas on television depicted Israeli intelligence agents as villains, reflecting the public mood. In Israel, officials began speaking openly of Turkey as a hostile actor rather than a partner. Yet, even in this frosty period, interestingly, trade between the two nations scarcely suffered and in fact continued to grow. The strategic and economic underpinning of the relationship still existed, but politically the bridge had been all but burned by 2010's events. If Davos was a public diplomatic drama, an even more serious rupture followed a year later on the high seas. In May 2010, a Turkish civil society group organized a humanitarian flotilla to break Israel's naval blockade of the Gaza Strip. The flagship, the Mavi Marmara, carried hundreds of pro-Palestinian activists and aid supplies. As the flotilla sailed in international waters, Israeli naval commandos boarded the Mavi Marmara on the night of May 31, 2010, to enforce the blockade. In the violent clashes that ensued on the ship's decks, 9 Turkish activists were shot and killed and numerous others wounded. The incident ignited a firestorm. Turkey's government and public were outraged at what they saw as Israelis killing unarmed Turks on a peace mission. Israel argued its soldiers acted in self-defense when confronted by passengers wielding knives and clubs. Regardless of versions, the political damage was immense. The early 2010s were marked by this deep, but neither Turkey nor Israel completely closed the door to reconciliation. Behind the scenes, low-profile contacts and mediators worked to find a formula to mend ties. A turning point came in March 2013 during a visit by U.S. President Barack Obama to Israel. In a much-publicized diplomatic effort on Obama's last day in Jerusalem, He facilitated a phone call between Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan. On that call, Netanyahu formally apologized on behalf of Israel for operational mistakes during the Mavi Marmara raid that led to loss of life, and he agreed to compensate the families of those killed. Erdogan accepted the apology, a key Turkish demand, and both leaders agreed to work towards normalizing relations, including the return of ambassadors and dropping legal cases against Israeli soldiers. President Obama, who literally had to connect the two wary leaders via a telephone at an airport, hailed the exchange as a first step towards restoring a vital regional partnership. This 2016 normalization was greeted with cautious optimism. For Israel, one immediate payoff was that Turkey lifted its veto on Israeli cooperation with NATO, which allowed Israel to open a mission at NATO headquarters in Brussels, something Turkey had blocked during the feud. There were also talks of potential energy collaboration, with the discovery of large natural gas fields in the eastern Mediterranean. Both countries explored a proposal to build an undersea pipeline from Israel's gas fields to Turkey, which could transport Israeli gas to European markets. Although political mistrust and economic calculations have stalled that idea so far, its mere discussion showed the promise of renewed ties. Cultural and tourism exchanges also ticked up. Israeli tourist numbers to Turkey began rising again in 2017 after years of slump, and in a gesture of outreach, a prominent Israeli journalist even scored an exclusive one-on-one interview with President Erdogan around that time. Despite this breakthrough, rebuilding trust was slow and fraught. It took more than 3 years after the apology to fully normalize relations. Negotiations dragged on over the exact compensation sums, the wording of the apology, and Turkey's continuing insistence that the Gaza blockade be lifted. Finally, in June 2016, Israel and Turkey signed a comprehensive reconciliation agreement ending the 6-year rift. Under the deal, Israel paid Turkey $20 million in compensation for the families of the flotilla victims and formally reiterated its apology. In return, Turkey waived its demand that Israel end the Gaza blockade. Instead, Israel allowed Turkish humanitarian aid to transit through Israeli ports to Gaza, and Turkey agreed not to prosecute Israeli officers for the 2010 incident. Additionally, Turkey promised to prevent any terrorist or military activities by Hamas operatives on Turkish soil, a significant commitment, since senior Hamas figures were known to reside in or frequently visit Turkey. With these terms, both sides declared the diplomatic crisis resolved. By late 2016, ambassadors were reinstated. Ayten Naa became Israel's ambassador, and Kamal Okum took posts as Turkey's ambassador in Tel Aviv, symbolizing a return to normal diplomatic relations. However, the reconciliation proved fragile and at times superficial. Diplomats noted that core disagreements were far from resolved, chief among them the issue of Palestine. Indeed, as one policy analyst observed, the constant factor in Turkey-Israel relations is the ebb and flow of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which inevitably spills over into Turkish-Israeli dealings. This held true in the immediate post-2016 period. Tensions simmered barely beneath the surface. Erdogan continued to criticize Israeli policies loudly on the international stage, albeit now from the position of having official relations again. In 2017, signs of strain quickly resurfaced. In May of that year, Erdogan, speaking at a conference in Istanbul, challenged Israel's control of Jerusalem and called on Muslims to flock to the Al-Aqsa Mosque to protect it, provoking an angry response from Israel's government. In July 2017, after Israel installed metal detectors at Jerusalem's Temple Mount following a terror attack, Erdogan accused Israel of endangering holy sites, again drawing Israeli ire. These incidents showed that normalization had not altered the fundamental dynamic. They merely provided a diplomatic framework in which to argue. The true test of the renewed relationship came at the end of 2017 in December. U.S. President Donald Trump announced that the United States would recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and move its embassy there. This decision sparked outrage in Turkey. Erdogan convened an emergency summit of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation in Istanbul, where he lambasted both the U.S. and Israel. He labeled Israel a terrorist state and an apartheid regime for its policies towards Palestinians. In return, Prime Minister Netanyahu publicly scorned Erdogan's comments, suggesting that a leader who bombs Kurdish villages and imprisons journalists had no right to lecture Israel, and pointedly calling Erdogan Hamas's biggest supporter on the world stage. This war of words in late 2017 indicated that the reconciliation was already on thin ice. Matters came to a head a few months later. In May 2018, as the US formally inaugurated its embassy in Jerusalem, Palestinian protests erupted in Gaza and were met with deadly force by the Israeli army. On May 14, 2018, some 60 Palestinian protesters were killed in Gaza by Israeli fire, triggering international criticism. Erdogan, furious at the bloodshed, again denounced Israel as murderous and even compared the Gaza deaths to the Holocaust in rhetoric. Turkey immediately expelled Israel's ambassador in Ankara and recalled its own ambassador from Tel Aviv. Israel retaliated by expelling the Turkish consul in Jerusalem. The diplomatic relationship was essentially frozen again, less than 2 years after being restored. This marked the second major breakdown, showing just how swiftly the underlying political rifts could undo. From mid-2018 onward, Turkey and Israel entered another period of minimal official relations. No ambassadors, limited communication largely due to the fallout over Jerusalem and Gaza. Between 2018 and 2020, Turkish-Israeli relations remained in a state of open tension and the two governments frequently traded verbal barbs. President Erdogan seemed to make a point of bringing up Palestinian suffering in virtually every international forum, much to Israel's annoyance. For instance, at the UN and other venues, he accused Israel of genocide in Gaza and called for Muslim unity against Israeli actions. Netanyahu and later other Israeli leaders dismissed Erdogan's statements, sometimes citing Turkey's own contentious record to deflect criticism. This period saw little direct contact between senior officials. On the strategic front, both countries adjusted to the rift by deepening other alliances. Israel drew closer to Greece and Cyprus, moving forward with plans for a Mediterranean gas pipeline and conducting joint military exercises, effectively forming a Hellenistic and Mediterranean partnership explicitly excluding Turkey. Israel also found new friends in the Arab world. Relations quietly improved with Gulf states such as the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, largely due to shared concerns over Iran. Turkey, meanwhile, found itself regionally isolated. Erdogan's support for Islamist movements had alienated countries like Egypt, and his confrontational stance toward the UAE and Saudi Arabia left Turkey with few Arab allies by the late 2010s. Furthermore, Turkey's interventions in the Syrian civil war and disputes with the US strained its position. A major geopolitical shift came with the Abraham Accords in 2020, when the UAE-Bahrain normalized relations with Israel under US auspices. This was a stunning development. Key Arab states openly accepting Israel without any resolution of the Palestinian issue, precisely the issue over which Turkey had broken with Israel. The Abraham Accords left Turkey on the outside looking in. Ankara criticized the deals as a betrayal of the Palestinian cause, but they undeniably changed the regional landscape. Israel's isolation was diminishing, and a regional bloc was emerging that did not include Turkey. This realization, among other factors, prompted a rethink in Ankara. Concurrently, Turkey's economy was entering a troubled phase with high inflation and a weakening currency by 2020. Erdogan's government faced domestic pressure to improve economic ties and attract foreign investment. In fact, bilateral trade volumes climbed to record highs by 2019 to 2020, reaching around $6 billion and then $8 billion annually, heavily in Turkey's favor. Turkish exports, from textiles to electronics to food, continued flowing into Israel, and Israeli tech and chemicals found markets in Turkey. This economic interdependence acted as a silent stabilizer. As one analyst noted, despite fiery speeches and diplomatic freezes, economic interests often took precedence behind the scenes, with neither side truly wanting to sacrifice commerce for politics. Indeed, even when Erdogan thundered about suspending ties, actual trade never halted. Airlines kept flying and companies kept dealing. This reality set the stage for a potential thaw, the mutual realization that a complete rupture was costly and that cooperation had tangible benefits, mending relations with countries like Israel, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, or economically significant, became an attractive proposition for pragmatic reasons. Thus, in 2020-21, Turkey launched a charm offensive to repair ties with estranged neighbors. Turkish officials toned down criticism and sent feelers for dialogue to Cairo, Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Jerusalem. In Israel's case, the timing was facilitated by political changes. By mid-2021, Benjamin Netanyahu left office, replaced by a new coalition government under Naftali Bennett and Erdogan publicly acknowledged in late 2021 that Turkey would like to improve relations with Israel, even hinting at possible cooperation in energy once again. Throughout the cold years, a paradox persisted. Trade between Turkey and Israel kept booming. Businesses on both sides largely shrugged off political disputes. In fact, bilateral trade volumes climbed to record highs by 2019 to 2020, reaching around $6 billion and then $8 billion annually, heavily in Turkey's favor. Turkish exports, from textiles to electronics to food, continued flowing into Israel, and Israeli tech and chemicals found markets in Turkey. This economic interdependence acted as a silent stabilizer, as one analyst noted. Despite fiery speeches and diplomatic freezes, economic interests often took precedence behind the scenes, with neither side truly wanting to sacrifice commerce for politics. Indeed, even when Erdogan thundered about suspending ties, actual trade never halted. Airlines kept flying and companies kept dealing. This reality set the stage for a potential thaw, the mutual realization that a complete rupture was costly and that cooperation had tangible benefits. Signs of thaw became visible by 2021. Low-level diplomatic contacts reportedly resumed, and in November 2021, Turkey appointed a new defer to Israel as a gesture. The real breakthrough, however, unfolded in 2022. Israel's President Isaac Herzog undertook a historic visit to Turkey in March 2022, the first visit by an Israeli head of state in 14 years. Herzog met President Erdogan in Ankara amid much fanfare, signaling a mutual desire to turn a new page. This was followed by visits from both countries' foreign ministers to each other's capitals in the ensuing months. These high-profile exchanges helped melt the ice, and a series of positive statements emerged about reviving cooperation in areas like energy, technology, and tourism. By August 2022, the efforts culminated in a joint announcement. Turkey and Israel agreed to restore full diplomatic relations and reappoint ambassadors, officially ending the rupture that began in 2018. The decision came after a phone call, Israeli Prime Minister and President Erdogan, in which both expressed satisfaction at the progress made and congratulated each other on the renewal of ties. Within weeks, new ambassadors were named: Irit Lilian for Israel and Bakir Turanlı for Turkey, and by late 2022 they had taken up their posts in Ankara and Tel Aviv, respectively. The normalization was driven by pragmatic needs. As Reuters reported, energy cooperation loomed large as a motivator. Europe's search for alternative gas supplies made the idea of an Israel-Turkey gas pipeline attractive again. Turkey's economic woes also made reconciliation appealing, hoping it could unlock Israeli investments or tourism and improve Turkey's standing with Western partners. For Israel, restoring ties with Turkey, a major regional power, was strategically valuable, especially as it normalized with Arab states. It allowed Israel to diversify its regional relationships and possibly facilitate projects spanning from the Gulf through Turkey to Europe. US NATO officials quietly welcomed the Turkey-Israel reset as well, seeing it as a boost to regional stability. The tone in 2022 was cautiously optimistic. During Herzog's visit, Erdogan strikingly stated, "We will not agree on everything, but we intend to strengthen our cooperation," a realistic acknowledgement of continued differences but a commitment to dialogue. The two countries began discussing ways to increase trade and resume joint civil society forums. Even tourism saw an uptick, with Israeli airlines expanding flights to Turkey and thousands of Israelis vacationing in Istanbul and Antalya once more. Security cooperation, once a hallmark of the alliance, also showed tentative signs of revival. In 2022, Turkish intelligence reportedly helped foil an Iranian plot to harm Israeli tourists in Istanbul, and Israel publicly thanked Turkey, indicating a back-channel security coordination had resumed in the face of a common threat. Such events underscored that, beyond the politics, Turkey and Israel still have overlapping interests that benefit from collaboration. However, as history has shown, the real stress test for Turkish-Israeli relations invariably comes with developments on the Israeli-Palestinian front. And indeed, a mere year after normalization, a major crisis would challenge the renewed ties. In October 2023, the Middle East was shaken by a brutal war between Israel and Hamas. Hamas launched a massive surprise attack on Israel on October 7, killing civilians and taking hostages, leading Israel to declare war and besiege Gaza. This conflict put Erdogan in a difficult position. On one hand, he had just rebuilt bridges with Israel. On the other, the Palestinian cause is deeply rooted in his and his supporters' worldview. Initially, Erdogan's response was somewhat measured. He urged both sides to show restraint and even offered to mediate for a brief moment. it seemed Turkey might play a constructive diplomatic role. But as Israel's bombardment of Gaza intensified and casualties mounted into the thousands, Erdogan's tone changed dramatically. He accused Israel of committing genocide and war crimes against Palestinians. In late October 2023, he told a large pro-Palestine rally in Istanbul that Israel was a terrorist state and likened Israeli leaders to Hitler, an unprecedented level of invective even for him. He also announced that Turkey was suspending military and economic ties with Israel in protests, though subsequent investigations showed that trade between Turkey and Israel never fully stopped and Turkish exports continued flowing despite the rhetoric. This episode highlighted the enduring dual-track nature of Turkey-Israel relations, fiery political disagreements versus persistent underlying ties. Throughout the Gaza crisis, Turkey's government organized relief efforts for Palestinians and led international calls for a ceasefire, putting it at odds with Israel's war aims. Diplomatic relations strained severely. Turkey recalled its ambassador for consultations, and Israel temporarily evacuated families of its diplomats due to hostile public sentiment in Turkey. Yet, both countries carefully avoided a complete break. Erdogan's harsh words were aimed at galvanizing his domestic and Muslim world audience, but he stopped short of expelling the Israeli ambassador or cutting off trade steps that would have definitively shattered 2022 normalization gains. By early 2024, as the Gaza war subsided, Turkey and Israel were again quietly rebuilding a working relationship, proving that even after the most heated exchanges, they prefer not to fully sever the connection. From 1948 through 2025, Turkish-Israeli political relations have been characterized by cycles of alliance and is driven by both bilateral interests and broader regional currents. During the Cold War, Turkey's Western orientation allowed a covert friendship with Israel, even as public solidarity with Arabs constrained it. The 1990s brought an open, strategic partnership when regional peace and common threats aligned their interests. The 2000s, however, saw the resurgence of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the rise of a more Islamist-oriented government in Turkey, which led to confrontations and emotional breaks in 2010 and 2018. Yet, time and again, Ankara and Jerusalem have found ways back to dialogue, whether due to changing leadership, geopolitical shifts, or the simple recognition of mutual benefits. Trade and economic ties, in particular, have proven remarkably resilient and continue to act as a stabilizing undercurrent even in times of political crisis. As of 2025, Turkey and Israel have once more re-established full diplomatic relations, and both seem keen to insulate their cooperation in areas like commerce, energy, and security from political disputes. Nonetheless, the relationship remains fragile and highly sensitive to developments regarding the Palestinians. Every Gaza war, Jerusalem flashpoint, or West Bank upheaval has the potential to influence Turkish public opinion and elicit a sharp backlash from Ankara, which in turn provokes Israeli indignation. Leaders on both sides appear to recognize this pattern. Israeli officials have come to expect a degree of Abulian criticism from Erdogan and may sometimes tune it out, focusing on pragmatic ties. Erdogan, for his part, calibrates his rhetoric to maintain domestic credibility while avoiding irrevocable breaches with Israel. In essence, both countries are learning to manage their differences without letting them completely derail the relationship. The trajectory of Turkey-Israel relations since 1948 underscores a broader lesson in international affairs. Interests may wax and wane, and ideologies may clash, but geopolitics often compels cooperation even between unlikely partners. Turkey and Israel, each an outsider in the Arab Middle East in its own way, have repeatedly found common cause in the face of shared challenges, whether containing Soviet influence decades ago or countering regional security threats today. At the same time, their ties have never been free of ambivalence, given Turkey's identity and leadership role in the Muslim world juxtaposed against Israel's conflict with the Palestinians. Going forward, the two countries will likely continue this balancing act. Periods of harmony will likely be punctuated by episodes of tension whenever regional crises erupt. As one analyst aptly observed, the ebb and flow of the Israel-Palestine issue will remain the central factor influencing Ankara-Jerusalem ties. In conclusion, the story of Turkey and Israel's political relations from 1948 to 2025 is a testament to both the possibilities and limits of diplomacy. It has seen secret alliances and public feuds, handshakes and heated confrontations. Each chapter, from the covert cooperation of the 1950s, through the strategic embrace of the 1990s, to the dramatic fallouts and reconciliations of the 2010s and 2020s, reflects shifting regional landscapes and domestic transformations in both countries. Today, with ambassadors again in place and dialogue resumed, Turkey and Israel stand at a hopeful juncture of engagement, but memories of past crises linger as reminders of how quickly winds can change. Their relationship remains a delicate interplay of realpolitik and principle, pragmatism and populism. Ultimately, both nations have shown an ability to compartmentalize, to cultivate economic and strategic partnerships even amid political disagreements, suggesting that while complete trust may be elusive, complete estrangement is neither side's long-term interest. The next chapters will no doubt bring new tests, but also, perhaps, new opportunities for these two historical partners to redefine their cooperation in a changing Middle East.